Welcome to the Hyper Room. I'm your host, Casey Lau. Each episode of the Hyper Room, I'll be interviewing people from different walks of life that are in the pop culture world. From comics to movies to toys to video games and beyond. People who contribute to the creative or business side of the pop culture industry, giving you insight into the thought process behind your favorite pop culture stuff.
The Mage series is one of the most influential independent comic series ever published, and the trilogy that started in 1984 with The Hero Discovered, continued in 1997 with The Hero Defined, now comes to its epic conclusion this year with The Hero Denied. Mage follows Kevin Matchstick, a normal guy that finds he's not only the reincarnation of King Arthur, but that he's being guided through a world of magic within hours. This is way before a boy wizard made his way to Hogwarts. Guided by the world mage and encountering everything from ogres to grackleflints to dogs with human heads, Kevin finally accepts his calling, and armed with a light-up baseball bat standing in for Excalibur and reincarnations of his Knights of the Round Table, as well as other mythic heroes, does he stand to prevail against the dark forces he encounters throughout his life. Mage has merged realistic urban storytelling with fantasy and myths into a thrilling story of self-awareness, rebirth, and redemption. Matt Wagner has been one of the great voices in comics since he introduced Grendel from upstart new publisher Comico back in 1983. Since then, he went on to create Mage and win numerous awards for his work. Matt has written The Demon and Sandman Mystery Theater for DC Comics, and is now embroiled in the pulp era of heroes, producing The Shadow, Green Hornet, and others for Dynamite Comics. But his creator-owned characters are what defines his career in comic books. To really appreciate this interview, you need to go back to 1984 and see what an explosion of awesomeness was being created in the pop culture world. It seemed the world was on fire with new ideas in comics, movies, TV, and video games. The independent comic scene really exploded with the works by Matt Wagner, Mike Baron and Steve Rude, Howard Chaykin, and many, many others, which was, in Matt's words, like a punk rock movement, and a revolution that is still being felt all over comics today. This interview revolves around Mage, from its humble pre-computer beginnings to its upcoming Image Comics finale to be published in late 2018. We only briefly touch on Grendel, and that is because I hope Matt will enter the Hyper Room again so we can devote an entire episode to that legacy character. This episode goes inside baseball and Mage, and although no spoilers are revealed, you might want to reread or read for the first time the series before or after listening to this. So join me as we learn how a 23-year-old Philly native introduced a world where magic is green, a lead character who reflects his creator physically and mentally, and discuss the origins of an epic comic book series 30-plus years in the making. Please welcome Matt Wagner into
The Hyper Room.
The Hyper Room.
Thanks for joining us today, Matt.
Sure. Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So to kick it off, I want to kind of place you in the timeline of pop culture. So maybe you can share with us, what is your earliest pop culture memory when growing up? Maybe it's a book, a comic, a movie, a TV show. What's the thing that you remember?
Well, I grew up reading comics. My mom was an English teacher, and so she was always after me to read. I was an only child, and I grew up kind of out in the country, somewhat isolated. So I drew to entertain myself. So comics were reading and drawing all in one neat little package. And unlike a lot of English teachers of her day, my mom didn't mind that I was reading comics. So I started reading comics pretty darn young. As far as one specific thing, I don't really know. I know that Adam West Batman show weighed real heavy in my youth, mainly because we didn't have cable, so I could only watch it when I went over to my parents' friend's house. They had cable, and they also had a color set, which we didn't have, which is, of course, for that show particularly made it more enjoyable.
So you don't.
I'd say no, not one specific comic. Again, I read comics so much, including. Back in that day, so I was born in 1961, so this is probably around 67, 68, something like that. At the point of purchase rack at the grocery store on the way out, they had Classics Illustrated comics, and my mom would buy me those pretty regularly because those were adaptations of classic literature, which she hardly approved of. So I ended up reading a whole bunch of those when I was young too. As far as any one comic, I can't really point to one because there were just so many. I had a lot of comics from a pretty young age.
Yeah, same with me. My mom is the one responsible for me getting into comics. She would always, when she came home, she'd just grab whatever was on the spinner rack and bring it home for us, me and my brother. So yeah, I think a mother's approving and supporting comic book reading is a trend, definitely.
Yeah. Now, granted, she thought I'd grow out of them.
Exactly.
Instead, I grew into them.
It's your career.
But yeah, no, I don't have a real one comic in mind that turned me. It just seems to me I was always a comic reader. Always.
All right, so let me tell you my earliest Matt Wagner memory. So I worked at a comic book store in Vancouver, and this guy came in on a tour promoting his comic called Mage. So this is a long time ago. And, our connection is that your sister-in-law used to work at that comic book store way, way, way back, right?
Yep.
Before she went off to do all her work with you and all the other comic book people, Diana Schutz, right? And it was also your sister-in-law. So it's really cool that we had that little connection. But I never really worked with her. She already left by the time I started working there, and she went down to San Francisco, right? And that's where her whole career took off. But that's the weird little connection that we have.
Wow, cool.
About Mage and Matt Wagner in my life.
So that was 1985. How old would you have been then?
I was probably too young to be actually working at a comic book store. But I mean, back then that was a big dream, and it was very exciting in that time. So 1985, that was the time. So going back, 1984, right? This is when Mage comes out. And, actually it is such a historic year for lots of things, right? The Apple Macintosh had come out. Ghostbusters, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, Star Trek 3, Terminator all come out. Magnum P.I., A-Team Knight Rider on TV. Alan Moore takes over Swamp Thing. She-Hulk takes over the Things role in Fantastic Four. Marvel's superhero Secret Wars begins, and the first issue of Ninja Turtles comes out. So it's an extremely historic year, and it's also in February of that year, Mage, the Hero Discovered, comes out from Comico. What is going on in the 23-year-old Matt Wagner's mind at this time?
Well, you have to preface that with the fact that we had started out doing a line of black and white comics initially from Comico. One of those was Grendel. That lasted about 3 issues. I got only moderate response from Grendel. And then Comico decided they needed to move into color production to be competitive. And they had just signed Chuck Dixon at the time to write a book that his then wife, Judith Hunt, was going to draw called Evangeline, about a assassin nun in the future who works for the special ops unit of the Vatican. Well, anyway, it's always cheaper to what they call gang print comics, so that the printing press is so wide that you can easily do 2 side by side for nearly the price of 1. So you cut your costs way down. So they were scanning around and said, which of us should develop a color comic? And of the 4 black and white comics that initially came out from Comico, Grendel had gotten the most positive response, and so they said, "Well, can you come up with something?" So at the time, I was really I had an interest in Arthurian legend, and I had started a kind of aborted different version of the Return of King Arthur in modern times, and it was much more straight ahead, not the kind of unique personal vision that Mage later became. And about that time, DC Comics announced they were going to do Camelot 3000, and I thought, well, okay, to hell with that. There goes that idea, and that Brian Boland guy draws a whole lot better than I do.
Yeah, right.
So I just abandoned the idea, and then Camelot 3000 came out, and it was certainly beautiful and everything, but it just didn't speak to me in the world I was living in. I was in art school at that time. I was living in Philadelphia. Didn't have a lot of money. Very much kind of lived a life. I wouldn't say on the streets, but it involved the street. And I just thought, you know what? That's not Camelot 3000 isn't speaking to me, because I don't know anybody like that. I don't know anybody that wears armor and carries swords in the modern day. All I know is a bunch of guys in t-shirts and jeans running around the city. And nobody had
Cherry Coke.
Yeah, nobody had with cherry Coke, which of course you had to mix in those days, with some cherry syrup. It didn't come in a can. I didn't know any guys that had armor or anything like that, but I knew a bunch of guys that had a baseball bat stuffed under the seat of their car just in case there was a problem. And so I very much wanted to personalize the myth that I was not getting from Camelot 3000.
So why did you? So if Grendel was the first one out and had response, why did you go for Mage instead of doing a Grendel series?
Because we just at that point we felt like the black and white books were a dead end. That the things we had done in black and white were going to be a dead end, and we needed to compete on a different level, and that meant a whole new narrative. It was only after Mage started to get a bit of attention and response, that I started hearing from readers that said, "Hey, what about Grendel? You stopped that in mid-story. Whatever happened to that?" And then that inspired me to revamp Grendel into the more deco illustrated novel kind of style that became the backup series of Grendel featured in Mage. And that began with issue number 6. So there were 6 whole issues there that it took me to get around to revamping that. Wow,
that's great. So you said you went to art school. Is that the training that you had to get into comics?
Yeah, a little bit of that, and a little bit of self-taught. I went to art school in Philadelphia. I went to what was then called the Philadelphia College of Art. It is now called the Philadelphia University of the Arts. It merged with a performing arts school and now has a wider umbrella so far as what sort of programs they offer. But I also went 2 years to a school in Virginia, a liberal arts university before that, a school called James Madison University. And I got some really good training there. I was an art student there, but the best training I had there was I worked for the school on-campus newspaper. It was a pretty big school, so the print run on the newspaper was 30,000 copies, something like that would just show up on campus twice a week. You'd just all of a sudden find big piles of them everywhere, and it was called The Breeze, and everybody read The Breeze. So I did a comic strip for them for 2 years, and then I was also the title changed over time, but eventually it was their graphics editor was what they ended up calling me. Basically what I was their spot illustrator. So twice a week when they went to press, which was Sunday and Wednesday night, I had to show up at the offices around 9:30 at night, and they had the paper all laid out at that point. And wherever there was a dead spot, wherever they didn't have copy or an ad or a photo, I had to do a spot illustration to fill that in. And sometimes it was connected to an article. Sometimes it was more editorial, cartoony sort of stuff. But I couldn't leave that night until all of that shit was done. Usually took me till 2:30 in the morning, something like that. And that was just an invaluable experience for me because for the first time in my life, I wasn't drawing because I wanted to. I was drawing because I had to. I was drawing because it was my job. And for that, I got a 1-credit A, and I think it was about $37 a month, which, back at that 1980, I thought I was on top of the world, believe me.
Wow. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, because that kind of outlet doesn't really exist anymore, right? People are just going to draw and put it on the internet and not really have that kind of pressure of a deadline or things like that. I feel like that kind of not stress, but that kind of pressure gets you to do some very creative things.
Yeah, I mean, I still work under that pressure now. I mean, maybe it doesn't exist for a lot of people, but that's the way I address my art and my craft and my profession.
Did you read a lot of this Arthurian legend growing up? Is this like an interest level of yours?
Yeah, I had a girlfriend in high school who was into it. That explains a lot, doesn't it? And I remember I read there was a famous trilogy by an author named Mary Stewart called it was called the Merlin trilogy. So it was the Arthurian story, but told from the point of view of Merlin. And Merlin was presented more not as a sorcerer, but more as a druid with some psychic powers and an intelligence level kind of beyond his medieval peers, And from there, I read a few more. I did more research when I actually started Mage, and then of course that just became a big wide open hole to examine a whole lot of the world's mythologies and legends, and I've never really let go of that ever since.
Yeah, it's interesting you point out because like Camelot 3000, I do remember that series. I remember that as being a kind of a, more obvious in your face. Hey, here's King Arthur. He finds a sword again. He comes back to life and the whole thing starts again. Where yours was more mysterious and actually did also make me look more into what it is all about and more of the history of it. And honestly, whenever I see a King Arthur TV show or movie today, I think about
Mage. Like
Mm-hmm,
that's
mm-hmm.
where I got introduced to the whole story back when I was a little.
Mm-hmm.
And you say it's like an allegorical autobiography. I know, like when you just said it, you kind of grew up on the streets. You knew guys with baseball bats. I can see that now. I can feel it all through the first series. But how do you play your life into the story itself?
Well, on the most obvious level, that's why it's taken me this long to complete the whole trilogy. I had to let
Yeah.
my life unspool, and I had to let my life happen in order to be able to reflect upon it. I could have rushed into sequels earlier, but I think they would have suffered as a result. I would have been operating on the same kind of mindset, the same kind of reflections, the same kind of self-reflection that I had on the previous series. And what makes Mage kind of unique is how different each parts of the trilogy are, even though they are so obviously done by the same guy and in the same narrative tone, but just at so obviously different points in his life.
It's interesting, right? Because you look at something like Dave Sim Cerebus, he does 300 issues over, 30 years, and you're going to end up with 45 issues over the same amount of time, telling a story over so many decades. It's quite, and it still has its beginning, middle, and end kind of thing, I'm assuming, right?
Yeah, it does. Yep. Yeah, and Dave's thing I would say is more societal. Dave really had his at a certain point he wasn't focusing on Cerebus so much as the world around him. And Mage is definitely a very internal focus kind of narrative. In fact, I always say, I'm lucky to have my two titles because Grendel's kind of me looking out at the world and Mage is kind of me looking in at me.
So tell me a little bit about the landscape when you're about to work, when you're working with Comico, right? How come you were able to find a comic book company and Eastman and Laird had to borrow $5,000 from their uncle to print their first issue?
Oh, we borrowed money. It was
okay, great. Yeah,
I was lucky in that I was just not part of the publishing venture, and the way it all happened was absolutely by accident. I was at the art school I mentioned there, the Philadelphia College of Art. One day, I got on the elevator one day, and there was a guy at a Creation Conventions, which was an older series of conventions back in those days. They had a Creation Conventions T-shirt on, and I was like, "Oh, you read comics?" And we struck up a conversation. Well, he was one of the guys that later dropped out of school to form Comico. So it was just sheer luck and happenstance in that regard. But we kept at it. They all dropped out of school to try and start this publishing company. I followed about a year later. So they were already fully embroiled in the whole aspects of publishing. I, on the other hand, was still an art student, and it kind of stayed that way. I never really became part of the publishing end of things. I never really became part of the office. I stayed in the Comico offices were about 20 miles outside of Philadelphia, and I stayed in Philly in Center City and drew comics instead. And, I'm very happy to have escaped that end of things. It would have been easy to kind of become a more administrative role, but luckily I got the opportunity to just sit around and draw.
Well, yeah, exactly. The creator side is very exciting. I mean, your legacy, it doesn't even matter what publisher you're at. Right now, you're at Image. It's like totally different landscape. But, it's very interesting. So those guys who started Comico, they must have been growing up in the 60s and influenced by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby.
Yeah, Kirby was a big thing to that crowd. Yep. Mm-hmm.
And then there was a big influx of independent publishers that we don't see today anymore, like Antarctic Press, Continuity, Deluxe. They all came out with new publishing in the 80s.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So is that like a great? So do you think that was a good time to be in comics because there are a lot of different voices, Howard Chaykin, American Flag,
Mm-hmm.
Mike Barron, Steve Root on Nexus. It seemed to be like, to me, it always was like a very exciting time for comics that I haven't seen since even with the Image books.
Sure, it's I always equate it to the birth and explosion of independent comics there in the time frame you're discussing. I always equate it to the same thing that had happened in independent film about 20 years before that, and then in independent music about 10 years before that. So, you had the advent of directors like Scorsese and Coppola and Lucas and all those guys who were coming up and working outside of the studio system or outside the regularities of the studio system anyway. And then, on the music front, you had punk rock, which cropped up and, had a very do-it-yourself aesthetic and a very, fuck the man and fuck the corporations kind of vibe. And comics were the same way because, of course, we were all too aware that as comic creators, traditionally, anything you did, you signed away to the company. The company owned everything. No questions asked. And we were kind of the first generation of creators that said, hey, that's just not the way we want to do it. We want to be able to own what we create. So yeah, it was a very heady time. And as you outlined there, with the amount of people and the amount of projects and the amount of really kind of special voices that were cropping up at the time, it was kind of a golden age so far as independent comics goes.
And you were lucky, or not lucky, but you were in a different way. Mostly people like Frank Miller and Walter Simonson, they worked for the big companies and then were able to spin off into their own ideas. Where you worked on your original ideas, and then you went to work for the big two later on.
Yeah, it kind of ruined me. Well, it kind of, like I just joked there, it kind of ruined me in that, the other guys had worked for the big companies, and they knew the drill. They knew what it's like to work for the big companies. They knew what it's like to produce monthly comics for a giant company that's producing a whole bunch of comics every month. I was totally indie. I was totally used to doing things only my own way. And, that has kind of worked for me and against me in all the things I've done for the big companies. Luckily, when I've worked for the big companies, I've so far been very lucky in that practically every editor I've ever worked under knew, okay, just leave this guy alone. He knows what he's doing. He doesn't need us breathing down his neck. Just let him go. Whether that was Archie Goodwin kind of early on, later it was Bob Schreck. I've always just had good luck in that regard. And, as far as working for the big companies, it's fun. I enjoy, I view it as a band doing cover versions of songs that inspired them. So you get to add your 2 cents to the legendaria of stuff that you enjoyed as a kid. At this point, I'm getting kind of the end of my bucket list of things I loved as a kid, and I've finally had a chance to put my stamp on.
So now you find Comico, and they were going to publish Mage. Can you tell us what kind of print runs did you have back then?
Oh, geez. Oh man, you're asking numbers. You're asking numbers from 1985.
When people actually printed paper comics, that was like a big thing back then, right?
I don't know. I think the last issue of Mage printed around 45,000 copies, something like that. So discovered number 15. But that was, you got to remember, I had in the. It's funny you should mention Dave Sim, because I had struck up a friendship with Dave, and Dave had recently done a promotional tour for Cerebus, and nobody had ever really done that in comics before, So I took a page out of Dave's book, and I lined up this publicity tour kind of right in the middle of Mage. We did the Mage tour in 1985. And that was me and 3 of my buds. And I convinced Comico to rent us this tricked out van. And we drove all the way around the country for 2 months. And we covered like 14,000 miles. We did 27 signing appearances during that 2 months. But as a result, it worked. It got the word out about Mage, and so the print run on the final issue was actually the highest, I think, of the whole run. So
it's so funny because today you would probably just live stream something on Instagram or Facebook and get the same result.
Yeah, exactly. But I got to say, it was damn fun driving around the country. I mean, it was exhausting. It gave me this incredibly intimate view of the retail end of comics, which of course I didn't really know much about that stage in my life and my career. And it was such a wide range of comic stores and a wide range of responses. Some places, like for instance, you were talking about Comics and Comics there in Berkeley, had a line out the door. Other places, it was just me and the manager and his clerk.
I think that was the one I was at. Exactly.
Yeah. And
it was great because back then it was like we don't have social media, so how do we ever get to see a creator unless we go to like a comic convention or something like that? So having you actually come to the store was like a super big experience, I thought, because it's like, oh, here's a published comic book guy coming to town and talking about what he's doing, and you get to see up close. You're doing sketches and things, so this is like I think a big thing in it back then.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, it was. And I got to say, I enjoyed the hell out of it. It really it opened my eyes in many ways. It educated me in many ways. It also made me feel part of the community, made me feel part of the comic book community. Whereas before, I don't think I really felt that as much. I'd gone to conventions and such, but that's not quite the same as, actually rubbing elbows with the actual retailers, because after each signing, they'd take us out to dinner. So we'd get to communicate on, that more casual level than just the business level when we were in the store. So yeah, it really, I felt that tour really made me the comic book artist I am today.
Very cool. Yeah. And I don't really hear other people doing it.
They just go to San Diego and
Yeah.
they're done, or they do a circuit of all the conferences and that's it. So, but actually having one-on-one time in different stores is quite interesting, especially in this digital age where everybody just goes to their Facebook page and see what's going on.
And again, I will say a very vital element of all that was the fact that we were all really young. So there was a lot of driving, man. It was a lot of driving. But we also did some cool stuff. We went to see the Grand Canyon and Mount Rushmore and Custer's Last Stand, and we did detour for a few, like, hey, we're here, we might as well go, kind of thing.
Yeah, you must have amazing photos from that trip.
No, actually not that much, because we didn't. This is before
we don't have cameras back then.
You had to carry around the camera, not like your cell phone. Yeah, it was kind of a pain in the ass. So no, I only have a couple of photos, truthfully.
Oh man. So I want to talk a little bit about the production of the original series, because I still remember the coloring was very interesting looking and different than anything else. And I guess today you can create that on a computer very easily, but back then, was that an airbrush?
Yeah. Okay. Well, this is a bit of a tale, so settle in. So it was at that point the kind of advanced and fledgling technique called blue lining. And so what that involved was they would take my black and white artwork, and they would make 2 copies of it on 2 pieces of film. One, a positive copy, so if you can imagine just a sheet of acetate with the line work of the page on it, and then a negative of that same image, right? So 2 pieces of acetate, one was a negative, one was a positive. And so then I forget the name of the company that sold this process back in the day, but they had these chemicals you could use, right? So you would treat a piece of paper with this one chemical, a developer, and then you would lay that negative image down on it, on the acetate, and you'd put it under a piece of glass, and you'd expose it to sunlight. I actually ended up buying a sun lamp, just like from a Woolworths, that we just tacked on the wall and put the paper underneath it. And then after 5 minutes, you'd turn off the sunlight, and you'd pull away that negative acetate layer, and it had made a blue line image. So everything looked like a blueprint of the line work. So that's what you actually colored. That's what you actually colored with traditional media. So I used watercolors, and you asked about airbrush. Yes, it was an airbrush, but it was also a very archaic and specific to the time period airbrush. It was an airbrush that ran off markers. Pantone or Design Markers, I can't remember which brand, had this thing that was basically a little collar, a little sheath that you would stick a marker in, a colored marker, and then using an airbrush, either a canned air or a generator, it would blow through a hose. It would blow a fine stream of air across the tip of the marker, blowing the colored ink off the marker in an airbrush kind of effect, right? That was really small, so it was really not very good for anything big, any sort of traditional illustration. But for the backgrounds of a comic book page, which were all quite small generally, it worked just beautifully. And it was also it was rapid because there was no actual paint passing through any gun. It was air blowing it off the tip of the marker. So I could literally just change colors as fast as popping out one marker and popping in a new one. And then the rest of it, all the figures, I did with actual watercolor. So then, reaching back to the beginning of this story, then you would take that the acetate positive sheet and just that was the line work, and you would just lay it over this sheet that you had colored underneath, and boom, there's the final image.
And then how is now you don't scan it in? How do they print it? How do they print
They
that?
did scan it, but it was a different scanning process in those days.
Okay.
Part of it in the old days, you had any scanning was done on a drum, not a flatbed. So that's why you generally had to work on soft paper so that they could wrap it around the drum. So, for instance, something like illustration board, which is a hard backing, that wouldn't work. So I tended to work on watercolor pads. Now, a watercolor pad is a whole pad of paper, watercolor paper, that's pre-stretched. Generally, when you're working with watercolor paper, you stretch it and tape it down so that you can get it real wet, and then after it dries, the edges are still the same, and it dries back to the same shape that it was initially. Whereas if those edges weren't tape down like that, it would all just buckle and crinkle terribly. So these pads were already gummed around the edges, and I could shoot a page and produce a page, and then you just peeled it off, and it was on watercolor paper, so it was soft enough to wrap around the scanning drum. Boy, that's a lot of technical information, outdated technical information.
That is incredible. So you went from drawing black and white black and white Grendel, and in such a punk rock fashion, decided to go over the top for your first color series.
Yeah.
This sounds...
Yeah, and I worked it out as I went. Too. It was, okay, I don't know how much of this you want to include, but I distinctly remember this one night. I had this group studio with a bunch of guys, Rich Rankin, Neil Vokes, Bill Willingham. This is when I lived in Philadelphia. It was after I dropped out of school. And this is around issue 4 of Mage. And I remember I was coloring it at that point. It was, the artwork was done. But I went over there real late at night, like 11 o'clock. Everybody else was gone. And I remember getting out my watercolors, and I kind of set up a spot over in the corner. And I rolled myself like 3 joints. And I just sat there, and all of a sudden, everything just started to work. All of a sudden, I specifically remember that night, I was like, wow, I'm really getting this. This is all working now. I understand what I'm doing for the first time. Whereas, up until then, I was kind of just plugging around through the darkness, you know what I mean? Looking for the right thing. But I distinctly remember that night, just like everything came together.
Well, you can see your art style completely, start to evolve from issue 1 to 15, right? Is it you, or is it the inker, or how does it evolve into this kind of form? Or is it just you just evolving?
We brought Sam Keith on as inker with number 6 because, again, after that special night I had there, I started to figure out how much the color meant to me and how much the color was so significant. And I was not going to be able to write, pencil, ink, and color even a bi-monthly book at that point. So we brought on Sam to kind of expedite the matters. And the whole choice for me was, do I want to hold on to the coloring, or do I want to hold on to the inking? And I wanted to hold on to the coloring at that point because I had started to realize how crucial it was and how the stuff I was doing was not looking like other comics at the time. So yeah, it was a...
Did you discover Sam Keith, or was he already around, or how did he come into it?
Sam had, Comico had done a book called Primer, and in the second issue of Primer was the first appearance of Grendel. Sam had a short story that appeared in one of the primers. And Sam very obviously liked to ink with a brush. I was very much a brush guy instead of a pen guy. And so I just thought, let me try Sam. I need to get an inker. Let me try Sam. So contacted him, and I did a sample page, and he inked it. And from there, it was off to the races, man.
Wow, great. And then, so in your coloring and all your crazy ideas of how to color the comic, did the color of magic was it always green, or was it something that you discovered along the way?
Yeah, it's green at the very beginning of the series. Yeah. It started, again, once I was kind of figuring out these coloring techniques, the green became more vibrant and centralized, I guess is the best way to call it. But again, everything just seemed to work all of a sudden. I was able to create an atmosphere with my color, which is, of course, comic book coloring back in those days didn't do much of that. It was either bright or it was dark. That was it.
No subtleties in the coloring. So that I think your coloring was one of the things that really... Yeah,
no subtleties in the coloring, and also not much in regards to cast light and reflective shadows and all that sort of stuff that I was able to pull off with watercolor that, of course, you couldn't do with flat color. So
coloring it, I guess that also defines how you draw, right? Because I'm sure the pages, black and white pages, are very spacious or a little bit more empty, so that you can add the color in there.
Absolutely, and it depends on who I'm working with as a colorist. Now, luckily, this is a great segue. Luckily, on The Hero Denied here, I'm working with my son. So, there's just a great level of communication and understanding there. Again, he grew up in my studio. He knows the artistic language I speak. At the beginning of each issue, we don't have a shit ton of notes back and forth. A little bit here and there, but if I have something specific in mind, I'll point it out to him. But then going into each sequence, he's like, "Hey, this is what I'm thinking with this," and usually I just say, "Yep, that's right. Go ahead."
And it's done quite quickly on the computer now. I assume, right?
Yeah, although Brennan has a very painterly approach to his computer coloring, so I don't know that it's necessarily any quicker than actual paint. truthfully.
It just dries faster.
Yes, indeed.
So I go back. So this first series is completed, and I remember that Starblaze released all of them in trade paperbacks. I think this is like the first time series been collected like this. I mean, you already originally defined the series as 15 issues. Now, the limited series it wasn't a big thing. I think it was starting to come out with Wolverine from Marvel and things like that. But you defined it 15 issues. Did you design it to be that way? Did you design it to be a trade paperback? I mean, I don't know. It's all these questions today are. But
I can't remember why I latched on to 15 as that was what it was going to be. That's too long ago to recall. But the interesting thing there about that Starblaze thing was that was in the days before comic book publishers realized we can do our own collections. We don't have to farm this out to somebody else. Comics were still going through a self-identity crisis at that point. Are we art or are we trash? And the fact that a regular book publisher was interested in doing these collections of comics, gave us all a sense of. No, we're a real thing, Of course, that would never happen now. Everybody does their own collections or goes straight to a collected edition. Not even serializing in periodical form.
Exactly, it's crazy. Yeah, but I still have those as well, and they were different size too than the comic. Do you remember why that was?
Yeah, because again, that seemed to be the we have to make this bigger because it's. I can't remember why, because that's what they had done with ElfQuest and A Distant Soil, the Colleen Doran series. So it was like, well, that's the way we do it. Learning curve, all a big learning curve,
Yeah, it's all learning curve, exactly. But it defines so many of the traditions that are used today. So I think it's quite interesting. And then so now the 15 issues are completed. And you're looking for new projects, and I've heard the story that you met Dick Giordano, and he asked you to pitch something. You pitched The Demon, and then now you use your style and go into working for one of the big two. How does Mage 2 sit in your mind now? Is it I'm done, I got to take a break from it and go work on some other stuff, or what is it doing now in your mind?
You mean The Hero Defined?
Yeah, The Hero Defined.
So the events of if we're looking at this as a autobiographical allegory, like you mentioned, the events of The Hero Discovered, I was kind of living those at the time that I was mythologizing them in that. The events of The Hero Defined, I was about 5 years past those events when I was authoring that version of my life. And here with the newest one, no, more like 15 years past the time frame. And I now realize that with each of those stages, I just needed more distance every time. I needed to look at my life in a broader sense, on a very just sheer physical description. This newest one features my kids. I had to wait for my kids to grow up. I had to wait to see what kind of people they were going to be. Couldn't have really done that if I was doing it when they were actually the ages they are in the comic now.
Do you find that working on, say, DC or Vertical series allows you to, cultivate your talent a different way and utilize it for when you come back to Mage?
Oh, sure. Storytelling is all, every tale I tell, I get better, I'm very much a forward-looking creator. For instance, my studio's in my house. It's a daylight basement in my house. And I have stuff up here in the studio that's my stuff, but I don't have any of my own art on display in the house. And the reason for that is I couldn't bear to look at it that long. I every time I finish something, I'm on to the next thing. I'm moving ahead. I'm like a shark. I have to keep swimming to keep my gills working, If I had a piece of my own upstairs in my living space on display, I would only look at it and focus on what I didn't like about it. I would only be like, yeah, could have done better there. Yeah, could have done better on that part. And
sure.
And that stuff, that's a good thing, but it weighs you down if you're sitting there looking at the old work too much, But don't be bogged down by it. Don't be anchored down by it.
Sure. Do you still own the original artwork for all the first series?
Oh, no.
Or all the series?
No, those have been sold off mostly for the years. I have certain stuff that I've kept that's like, yeah, I'm keeping that one. Both of the big 2-page spreads from the two Batman Grendel crossovers. I still have those.
So now you mentioned your studio, your home studio, I'd like to ask you a little bit about how do you create on a daily basis? Do you wake up early? Do you start drawing before dawn?
I'm like a plumber.
Okay.
I'm absolutely a creative creature, and that is my entire being. But I'm not somebody that flits around through life. I'm very purposeful. I'm very organized for the most part. My wife's a school teacher, so she gets up really early to leave for school. I always get up with her. I'm also our family cook. My wife doesn't even boil water very well. So, I got to get my work done and then be ready to go to the grocery store and get some stuff to cook for dinner. And that just works really well for me. Even back in the days when I was young, that late night thing I had with my special coloring moment with a couple of joints, that was a rarity for me in those days. I didn't really do a lot of late night stuff.
Yeah, I guess you have to be like that to be able to produce the work that you do, right? I think that you couldn't be somebody who procrastinates and thinks about what you're going to do without producing a body of work that's, it's accomplished and it's actually completed and it's on its way to completion in this stage for Mage.
It's also I just have this attitude of, be fearless. There's nothing scarier for an artist than the blank white of a page that you're getting ready to start.
Yeah.
And I will say, even at this stage of my career, every goddamn time I sit down in front of a blank page, always runs through the back of my mind. Oh, is it going to work this time? There's always that little bit of doubt, which I think is a healthy thing. But you really have to kind of make it work for you. You have to. I always joke around and say I'm really good at slapping my muse around. If I'm stuck, I know what I need to do. I need to get up. I need to get out of the house. I need to walk around. I need to do something. I need to break the routine. Just sitting there staring at that blank page isn't going to do me any good at all.
Now you are halfway through, as of this recording, halfway through the final part of the trilogy, the Mage trilogy, The Hero Denied.
Oh, I'm in fact 3/4 of the way through.
Okay, yeah, that's what I'm going to talk to you about. How far? So all right, let's talk to Image. We're going to do the finale. Do you have the entire 15 issues plotted out? Do you do it month to month?
No. Yeah, I don't do that with Mage. I don't plot things out in advance. I tend to treat it like a Zen journey. I sit down. I don't know if you've ever read. I sit down and let the story take me where it's going to go. I don't know if you've ever read Stephen King's On Writing, which is a short little memoir he did about being a writer, his history as a writer, his thoughts as a writer, and he talks about how he's not really a copious note taker. He's not really big about doing these complicated breakdowns. He, of course, at this point in his career, he's extraordinarily accomplished, and that power that he wields as an author is something he's very comfortable with. But he comes up with a concept, he comes up with characters, and then he just starts writing, and he lets the characters take him where they're going to go through the story. And I remember thinking when I read that, wow, that's the way I do it. And here to contrast that, many, many years ago, I was in England. I was at a convention in England, and some friends of mine and I drove up, and we spent the night at Alan Moore's house, and that was really intriguing on many, many levels. But Alan, at that point, was working on Big Numbers. Do you remember Big Numbers, which was the aborted self-published thing that he was doing initially with Bill Sienkiewicz and then with Al Columbia? Big Numbers was famously going to be 10 issues. So he took me up to his writing room, and he pulled out one of those giant sketch pads, the big 18 by 24 sort of things. And he had it divided off in 10 columns vertically. So those are the 10 issues. And then probably 24 or 30 columns horizontally. Those were the characters that he had written down in the left-hand margin. And then in those little squares that were made by that grid, he had written in the tightest, most intricate little writing, he had written every fucking thing that happened to that character in that issue all the way up to issue 10. And I remember saying to him, saying, "Wow, man, you and I don't work the same at all."
Yeah, that's amazing. So, usually I would think that that's how you did it. 'Cause especially when you have a finite series of 15, you're like, okay, issue 1 will do this, issue 2 will do this, issue. But I'm reading it now, the new series, and I'm thinking, yeah, it feels like I'm on a journey. It doesn't have an actual. We know we're going to see some magic creatures here. We're waiting to see if there's a new mage showing up. We have these kind of touch points that we think we know, but you seem to be taking your own twist, your own turn on how it's going to come out, which I find to be quite exciting because we don't know what's going to happen now.
It has to be a surprise for me too, right? It has to. I can't tell you the number of times I'm working on specifically Mage where I'm like, oh, that's what's supposed to happen here, and it's just what's supposed to happen there. It just works. I'm sure many musicians could tell you the same thing. That they start off with one sort of little riff line, and then they've developed a whole song or a whole movement or a whole orchestral movement on just a little riff that they followed and jammed on, and they knew the structures when they started, but they didn't quite know how it was going to end up.
So, do you spend more time writing the story of the issue or drawing it?
I tend to I draw it first. I don't do the script until afterwards. As I'm drawing it in my head, the characters are saying what they're saying. And then I sit down and I actually firm up those words in an actual script. And that takes a little. Then okay, on page 8, I got to squeeze in a little information here that I didn't get across in page 6. That sort of thing. But yeah, that too's just again just kind of a Zen journey.
You draw with pencil on paper, and how long does it take to do a page?
Yeah, I do. Yep. Still analog, as they call it.
And then it takes you do you produce a page a day, or how fast do you draw?
Well, it's so I don't pencil and ink it all at once. I tend to pencil the whole issue, and then I ink the whole issue. So penciling the whole issue, so that's 23 pages, takes me about 2 weeks, and inking it takes me about 2 weeks. So that averages out to one finished page per day.
And what issue are you on now? What issue is completed now?
I just tomorrow I'm inking the last page of number 12.
Wow.
And number 7 is just getting ready to ship. So yeah, it's funny, man. It's funny. Hearing everybody's responses, about what's going on in issue 6 and 7. I was like, yeah, you don't know shit about what's going on yet.
Yeah, and that's another thing, right? Before, in the old days, you'd get mail from the readers, and then you'd hear responses, but that might be months later, and then you've already almost finished the series. Like today, you can get immediate feedback from people. Does that change a little bit how you produce stories?
Yeah, although I think back in the day, that was one of the things I really liked about comics was the immediacy of it. How you could wrap up a comic and you could get it to the printer and it could be on the stands all in the space of a couple of weeks, really, and then you'd start hearing. If you had a PO box or something like that, you'd start hearing back pretty quickly. Additionally, unlike almost every other pop culture thing you can think of, you can go to a comic convention and meet all your favorite heroes. You can't go meet your favorite rock star easily. You can't go meet your favorite director easily. You can't go meet your favorite sports star easily. You can go to any convention and meet almost every creator pretty darn easily. Yeah, there's a few, there's Todd and Frank, and, we have our Elvises that, leave the building eventually. Yeah. Pretty much every other comic creator, you can kind of go, just walk up to them and shake their hand and say, dig your stuff, and that's an immediacy that I really like. Now here it's a little bit different because, I'm getting everything via email instead of, handwritten letters, but I don't know. It still feels immediate to me. I again, going back to that punk rock analogy, back in that day, it was almost like, we're going to do a comic. And that was like, we're going to form a band and put on a show, The final issue of Mage, I'll never forget, because at that point, so you're familiar with Joe Matt's work?
Sure.
So Joe, was my college chum, and of course later figured prominently as a character inspiration in The Hero Defined. But for the last several issues of Mage, he was my coloring assistant. So the whole last issue of The Hero Discovered, we were, in my apartment in Philadelphia, and we were up for, I don't know, a good solid 24 hours wrapping up that issue. And so we finished it, and we rushed through town to the train station. and we got on the train to take the train out to Norristown, Pennsylvania, which again was where Comico was located, about 20 miles outside of Philadelphia. Took the train out to Norristown. Bob Schreck picked us up in his car at the train station. We rushed to the Comico offices. We went upstairs and put all the page numbers on the pages by hand. You had to cut them out and like stick them on by hand. And we hopped in Bob's car and we rushed to FedEx, and we got it to FedEx 3 minutes before they closed on a Friday. I will say we all got really drunk and stoned that night. It was quite a release, believe me.
Wow, that's just insane. I'm really digging these IDW Artist Edition books they're putting out. They're full color scans of black and white art from famous runs from the 70s and 80s, and just seeing the amount of liquid paper or whiteout. Sorry, I'm Canadian. The whiteout they put on these things to get those effects that you see in the comic eventually is just already quite amazing to me.
I was in DC once with a friend, and he had a friend who was lining up something and invited me along. So we went to the Library of Congress, and they have all the original art to Amazing Fantasy 15.
Oh, wow. Crazy.
And all you have to do is call up. All you have to do is call up and arrange a viewing. It's public. You're allowed to just go look at it. As a citizen of the U.S., you're not allowed to touch it. They bring it out with like white gloves and shit, but you're allowed to get right up on it and look at it.
It's not behind glass. It's just there.
No. They bring it out in a box and lay it right in front of you.
Wow, that's amazing. Okay.
So you literally bent over the table, like, your nose is like 4 inches from the page.
Wow.
And what's really neat is it's the entire issue, so it's not just the Spider-Man story. But what was really neat was seeing all the whiteout, as you're saying, seeing all the notes in the margins. One of the cool things was they initially were going to cut out the first page or the second page. I can't remember it. But it's all the character stuff that is what has made Peter Parker. It's all about him, being at home with Aunt May and Uncle Ben, and hey, get up, you're late for school, that sort of stuff. They were originally going to cut that out and just have him be a typical bullied teenager with no home life. Just at the last minute, they decided to leave that page in, and boy, what a change that made, huh? And so, that when you're seeing the art in the old days like that, with not only the whiteout, like you said, but also the production notes scribbled into the margins of the pages, boy, it really tells a tale that's really, really cool.
So now you took 10 years between Mage, the Hero Discovered, and the Hero Defined, and now it's been 20 years since then to Hero Denied, which is publishing right now. What has changed in the industry now for you?
Oh, Jesus, everything. I almost think I waited too long. But at the same time, I realized I couldn't have done anything different. It had to be this way. It just had to be. Everything about Mage to me is just like that. That's just what it had to be. There's been several other stories about not the return of King Arthur, but a chosen character, particularly a certain boy wizard with a lightning bolt scar. There's been a lot of these sort of narratives. So the only thing that makes Mage special is the peculiarity of its individuality. The fact that it's this family, this person, this tale. I'm not trying to. I don't have a lot of politically correct characters in there just to have them in there. You know what I mean? Which is these days when you're styling a narrative, and I've done it too. You want to even out the racial playing field, the gender playing field, but I just can't do that with Mage because it's like, well, this is just the way my life went. This is what happened. So yeah, a lot of things have changed, all for the better. I think I really celebrate the diversity of stories we have in comics. The kind of again fearless attitude of a lot of the young creators. Yeah, it's just a good time to be in. It's the comics it's the comics field that we imagined back when we were first breaking out of the mold.
So it's also just on side note of that, the second and the third series are published by Image. Why did you choose Image to publish and not like say Dark Horse or somebody else that you've worked with?
Well, because when Comico went bankrupt, that kind of screwed up a whole lot of my life. I just vowed to myself I was never going to have all my creative eggs in one basket again like I had with Comico. I had originally taken Grendel to Dark Horse, and Dark Horse has done wonderful for me with Grendel over the years. They've always treated me terrifically, very accommodating of anything I want to do. But at the same time, I was like, yeah, I need to take Mage somewhere else. And this was around the time after the first wave of Image success, and they were really kind of looking for what's going to breathe a little new life in over here. And hey, this guy that kind of started the whole indie comics thing that we're emulating wants to come do his thing over here. And this is when Larry Marder was the publisher, and Larry was very accommodating and very helpful and every way as far as getting me lined up over there to do Mage with Image. And in the interim, in the many years ever since, a whole lot of the Image crew, like for instance Jim Valentino, and then in more recent years Robert Kirkman. Every time Kirkman would see me at a con, he'd be like, "Fuck, man, when are you going to finish Mage? We're ready. We're ready. Anytime you want to start it, just go ahead and start it. You don't even need to tell us. Just start." So yeah, they've been wonderful and very supporting Mage is absolutely the mission statement that they started with and continue with.
How do you define a modern comics creator today? It feels like a lot of people are like Stan Lee. They have their own soapbox on social media and things like that. Do you think that today's audience require a creator to be more than just a writer, an artist, but actually to be a social media, go to conventions and things like that?
Yeah, I think probably so, but who knows how long, again, the effects of social media and this level of technology are all still really, really new. Those aspects you're talking about might become obsolete at one point. I don't know. There's with social media and the contemporary state of things, I find there's a lack of mystery. There's a lack of wonderment, and I think maybe a less is more approach might creep back in there at some point.
I don't know. I do enjoy seeing you on Facebook and saying, "Here's what the cover looks like. This is what I'm doing." I find it kind of neat that we have this relationship that I don't even know you, but I get his input.
As far as social media goes, I'm not real. Like, I'm not on Instagram and Twitter and all. I don't have all bases covered. I still keep it pretty. I'm just showing off stuff here on this venue.
I love it. I love it to find that out, because in the old days, it's just like an issue would just show up on this newsstand. Like, I don't know how it got there. I don't know where it's from. It just show up there. Now it might just show up on my iPad now and just be there, right? Crazy.
Yeah, I always try to describe to my son what it was like to be a comics collector back in my day. Or a comics fan, where it was you were part treasure hunter. You had to go digging through, like physically digging through shit, attics, basements, boxes of shit that were covered in mold and dust.
Exactly. And now, like, all these 1980s, 1970s Marvels and DCs are all like recolored and available by click of a button on an iPad. It's incredible.
And I can't really fault contemporary readers for that. I mean, I would have loved to have had that option at my younger age. At the same time, I love the sense of wonderment and discovery that accompanied my initial comics fandom.
Exactly. So, are you watching the Marvel Universe movies and the DC TV shows and things like that?
Not all that much, truthfully. I tend to find when I'm working, specifically on Mage more than anything else, but I'm working on stuff, I don't want to absorb a lot of other similar narratives because I don't want to be colored by them. I would rather... I'm a voracious reader to this day, but I tend to read stuff that's not of a superhero vibe. Tend to read other stuff that I'm going to be able to pull into my narratives and use for my narratives. Stuff that will inspire me from a real world sense to create the fantasy that is my milieu.
Do you have the ending for Mage? Oh, interesting.
Kinda.
Yeah. And is it really going to be the end when we hit 15? Yep. Gatefold cover, right? It's going to have a gatefold cover or gatefold inside major spread.
Gatefold inside, yeah. It won't have a gatefold cover, no, but I have a gatefold inside, which I haven't worked out yet at all, but because I haven't written that one yet. By the time that one comes around, I'll know what it's going to be. But
I have one thing I want to ask you about. Like, this is quite interesting to me. I seen The Matrix when it came out, 1999, but I reread Mage, The Hero Discovered, afterwards. And I've always wanted to ask you this because, to me, I know there was a whole deal with The Matrix and Grant Morrison's Invisibles
as being some sort of like copy or anything like that. But I don't know. Have you ever seen this parallel? You brought up Harry Potter before, but I see a very direct correlation between The Hero Discovered and the first Matrix film.
I can't really go down that path because, to my mind, again, these archetypes are all hardwired into the human experience. I know I've talked several times about the effect of the anthropologist slash mythologist, as he would call himself, Joseph Campbell, on my work. George Lucas speaks a lot about Campbell's work and its effect on the initial Star Wars trilogy. But I didn't know anything about Campbell when I did The Hero Discovered. And of course, one of Campbell's most famous books is called The Hero with a Thousand Faces, wherein he describes the archetypical hero's journey in 3 different steps. And when I finally read that book and I read the first stage of the hero's journey, it was literally like reading a point-by-point breakdown of The Hero Discovered. And that really struck a resonant chord with me. I was like, wow, I lucked into that, or I happened to that, or I'm hardwired into that, like we all are. Those elements made sense to me in a way that I didn't understand in any sort of cognitive sense, more in an instinctual sense. They only made sense as I was doing it. And then afterwards, when I read Campbell's breakdown of the first stage of the hero's journey, it's like, I kind of sat back and wiped my brow and like, whoo, got that one right.
Yeah. But those are more like the story beats, like, how they you can see the crossover there. But something like The Matrix, I mean, when you see everything green and the guy finding the one, and that he has this other thing, I was just like, wow, this is incredible how similar it is. But specific. I mean, they have a more of a science fiction setting, and yours is more of a magical setting. But it's just incredible when I see that. I don't know how you feel, or
well, there was no baseball bat, so we're
exactly.
Okay.
And then just to wrap this up, I wanted to talk quickly about your work with these pulp characters. You do a lot of work with Shadow, Zorro, Green Hornet. Are you really a big pulp character fan?
Yeah, I am. Yeah. My parents were slightly older. My parents were World War II era. They were so my dad was 40, my mom was 36 by the time I was born. So I inherited a lot of genuine nostalgia from them. So yeah, pulp characters I had a big fondness for because, again, when I was young, there weren't a lot of reprints available, but there were some pulp reprints available. About the same time that DC first announced they were going to do Shadow, the Denny O'Neil, Mike Kaluta run. Just around that same time, all of a sudden you could get on LP vinyl, you could get the radio shows. So I was picking up some of those.
Oh, wow.
And then about a year later, Pyramid Books started republishing a whole series of the Shadow novels, pulp novels, with really beautiful, beautiful covers by Jim Steranko. So in the space of 2 or 3 years there, I had just a triple dose of the Shadow, piled on. So yeah, I have a genuine love for those characters because, again, they're so they're so genuine. They're not following any tropes that are already made up. They're making these up fresh on the spot, And
did you like Chaykin's take on it?
Initially
on the Shadow.
Initially, yeah, I did too. Howard had to make the Shadow a real dick. I don't have any troubles taking obsessed characters and remembering that they can still be heroic, and I count myself as a pretty liberal, not pretty liberal, I'm ravingly liberal politically, but I think it's a sacrifice and commitment are things that a lot of people miss as being heroic elements are there in all of those pulp characters, regardless of their era-specific racism, era-specific genderism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They are still people trying to make things better. I read a thing recently. Somebody pointed out that, in 1980, whatever that was, 4 or 5 that we were talking about, while Frank and Alan were tearing down every heroic archetype they could imagine, I was doing Mage, which was redefining a heroic archetype. I wasn't trying to tear it down. I was trying to make it make sense to a modern person.
Is there any character left out there that you might want to
If
dabble
they
in?
would give me free reign, again, this will never happen. If they would give me free reign to do Superman in the 30s, but they won't do that.
No. They took away his underwear. They gave it back to him.
Yeah.
We don't know what's going on over there.
But that's about the only one. All the other, I think the Shadow was kind of the last of my bucket list. I got to play with Batman. I got to do the Green Hornet, the Zorro. That was fun, but I'd like to do some just Superman by himself sort of thing. But I even got to work with Quentin Tarantino on a thing, on the Django Zorro crossover. I've had a pretty damn fruitful and lucky run of things, and got no complaints, but I got no plans of slowing down either. So I'm already talking to somebody about what my next project's going to be after Mage. So
will you be returning to Grendel?
It depends. We'll see. Yep, possibly.
He's always in the back of your mind there.
Grendel's an eternal. Evil never dies, man.
All right, so we're going to wrap this up, but I'm going to do a quick round of quick fire questions for you just to answer right off the top of your head. Who's your favorite Jack Kirby character?
Well, I obviously like the Demon for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
So this is a little. This isn't a quick fire answer. It's a slightly longer answer. OMAC.
Okay.
The
OMAC,
reason for that
OMAC.
is, I loved Kirby, but about the time I was reading Kirby is the age. Let's see, I was probably 10, 11. That's when you want to start stuff from the beginning, right? So that's why I like the Demon. The Demon was kind of a brand new Kirby series. OMAC was too. So my parents used to take me to this county fair in Pennsylvania every year that lasted for a whole week. And so I was about 8 or 9, something like that. And I saw my first airbrush artist. This guy doing airbrush T-shirts. Wow. And, he had this little section on the fairgrounds, and he had an easel set up, and he'd do, your girlfriend or your dog or your truck or whatever on a airbrush portrait on a T-shirt. And I had never seen this before, and I stood there and watched that guy for just hours every day. Finally, I saved up some of my fun money, and I got a T-shirt out of him. Well, the one comic I had with me at the time was OMAC. So I got him to do a fucking OMAC, a county fair airbrush OMAC T-shirt for me. Wore that thing to ribbons, believe me.
Do you have a favorite Kirby run? Would it be OMAC?
No. His run on OMAC was very truncated and full of some interesting stuff, but not complete. I'd have to say probably that. Probably the New Gods stuff, because that's what was fresh for me. Yeah. I didn't understand any of it. Like, it didn't make any sense to me because I was too young, Yeah. But it was mystifying, and that was intriguing as well. I loved stuff. It was like, I don't get that. I got to figure that out a little better.
Did you see the new Justice League film?
No.
Well, because they mentioned Mother Boxes, Steppenwolf's in it, and they mentioned Darkseid.
Oh yeah, I know they're incorporating the Darkseid stuff in there. Yep.
Kind of crazy to see parademons flying around. You're like, oh my god, they're going for it.
Guardians of the Galaxy 2 the other night. I was like, I can't believe I'm seeing Ego the Living Planet as a fucking cinema thing.
I know, right?
Yeah,
so crazy. The Thor Ragnarok is the design inspiration is pure Kirby. You'll see all these characters in the background that look all have those jagged design lines and weird things they're holding that didn't make sense in the comics.
Right. Big headdresses and shit. Yeah.
Do you have a favorite Jedi?
Oh, it's funny because back in the earlier days of Facebook, when those sort of things were cropping up, and said, which Star Wars character are you? And so I was like, all right, I'll click on that, and I went and did it. And I said to my son later, I said, all right, who was I? And without blinking an eye, without hesitating a second, he went, you're Obi-Wan.
Oh, wow.
And he was right. Actually, I think my favorite, though, is Luke. Because, again, I was that age. When Star Wars came out, I was 15. I never forget, my friend and I went to see it, and we went home, and we just raved about it to his parents. We were like, oh, my God, it's the best movie you've ever seen. It's incredible. They went to see it, and they came home and they said, that stunk. That wasn't about a war. That was about a 15-year-old kid, and we were just like, yeah, and we're that kid. That's why I really liked the most recent one. I was like, the Last Jedi. I was like, this just has to make good by Luke. If it makes good by Luke, I'm good with it, and it did. So,
do you have a favorite knight of the Round Table?
Kevin Matchstick.
There you go. Good one.
Oh, I guess he's the leader of the Round
He's
Table.
the leader. That's good. I'll take that. I'll take it. How about, do you watch Netflix? What's your favorite Netflix show?
Oh, sure. I watch tons of Netflix. I watch tons of cable. Well, Stranger Things is an obvious one, but I'm also a big fan of Black Mirror. Wasn't
Great
too
show.
nuts about the first 2 seasons, which were BBC produced and had all the kind of shortcomings that a lot of BBC productions have. But once Netflix took over, the 3rd season had 2 or 3 of, I think, the best science fiction things I've seen on TV ever. Social science fiction, I mean, not hardcore or hardware science fiction.
Yeah.
But the new season 2, just fabulous. Okay, so not Netflix, but on Amazon. My most recent Amazon thing that I loved was The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. I thought it was just incredible. It's about a 1950s housewife who becomes part of the 1950s Jewish housewife. Jewish, very big part of what goes on here. She becomes part of the fledgling stand-up crowd in 1950s New York. She becomes a pal of Lenny Bruce. She gets busted for obscenity. It's definitely a portrait of a time period and a statement about women's liberation that is just terrific. It's great. It's really, really great.
And do you have a favorite magician?
Favorite magician? That's going to be Merlin. Sure. He's otherwise called Mirth.
Yes, exactly. Matt, thank you very much for being part of the Hyper Room. I've enjoyed talking to you, and I cannot wait to see the finale of Mage in the next. When do you think? Do you know the date that for the last issue?
Oh, I forget what it is. I forget what. You're waiting to see the end. Meet you and me both, buddy.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Matt. Appreciate your time and your flexibility, Matt. Thank you very much. This has been great.
All right, right on. Glad that worked out, man.
Thanks, Matt.